I can't tell you how many clients I have who are so hypersensitive. Often with their partner, they will say really angrily, "You're not listening to me," or "I told you," or when they have to repeat themselves. And as people get older and they start having hearing issues, it really becomes more charged to have what you're saying not be heard or not remembered. And I know I'm very, very careful. And as I get older and I can't remember absolutely everything the way I used to be able to, people get really upset. So we want to be very mindful of how we listen, how we remember, how we track. And it's so important to our clients to be heard and remembered, because it is such a missing experience. And I remember when I first started therapy when I was 23, and I was convinced that as soon as I left my therapist's office, I ceased to exist. And she would completely not remember that I even existed in the world until I showed up for my next appointment. And I went multiple times per week. I went 3-4 times a week for a number of years because I really couldn't make it. I was suffering so much. I was convinced that if I wasn't right in her view, I didn't exist in her mind at all. So it was as if every day, every relationship starts all over again from scratch. And that is very much the neglect experience. And in psychodynamic terms, there was a concept called object constancy that sort of correlates to the game of peekaboo, where you kind of cover the baby's eyes and then you're still there when they take the blindfold off, and it's like peekaboo, it's like I'm still here. And even when you can't see me, I'm not gone. And so they begin to learn that, I can be here and you don't see me, but I'm still here. Well, I never experienced that when I wasn't there, I continued to exist. So when I first started therapy, I gave my therapist all this stuff because I thought, well, if I give her things, then she'll remember me. So I would give her things and I would make things for her, and I would want to put things in her office so there would be evidence of me. So I would continue to exist. It took me so long to begin to believe that I existed from one session to the next, even if it was the next day. People are this sensitive. So any way that we can let them know that they exist, that they're remembered, is hugely significant. And when we forget something or we miss something, it's over the top significant to many people. So we have to be very careful. We have to listen very carefully. We have to really work hard to remember what we hear and to track. We have to be mindful of the details, including the details that go on inside of ourselves. And again, all that material that flows through the field, we want to be mindful of and see how much we can remember and keep in mind. And I have some really interesting experiences sometimes. I had this one client once, and he had a girlfriend that left him, that broke up with him. And he was spending a lot of time in therapy trying to really do a postpartum of this relationship with this woman who really broke his heart. And the way he described this woman, I really didn't like her. And I had this profound distaste for her. And partly he was so angry at her, the way he talked about her as we went along, that I was really, in my empathy for him, sort of developing this real sort of angry feeling about her with him. And so as we proceeded through the therapy, one day I was driving home from work and I heard this story on the radio, and it was some kind of social justice organization that was doing, I think they were like employing ex-cons, which is something really, it's hard for ex-cons to get jobs. And it was, I think, a restaurant that went out of their way to hire ex-cons. And I was thinking about his ex-girlfriend, who I obviously didn't like, who was a social worker and who was interested in criminal justice and working with ex-cons. And I heard them talking about this project on the radio, and I thought about her, and I found myself having these really kind of charitable thoughts and thinking, that would be a good place for, her name was Jenny, or I'm calling her Jenny, that would be a good place for Jenny to work. And then I thought, how interesting that I'm having these sort of empathic, warm, helpful feelings about Jenny, who I've been so angry and bitter about. What is that? And it was very interesting. And so the next time I saw him, it was very curious. That week, he told me that he was having these really empathic, generous thoughts about her, and he'd actually written a letter to her, and he didn't mail it, but he was thinking about her and thinking about it. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. I wonder what I was picking up through the field from him. And these kinds of things, when we're really tuned into people, they happen. And then we find out that we are really connected in ways that would be really meaningful to them. And for me to share with him, that's so interesting. I thought about Jenny this week too, and I thought, some really kind of open-hearted thoughts about her, and it's so interesting to me that you were feeling more open to her. So to notice things that happen inside ourselves, and maybe something is happening in the relationship between myself and this client where we're getting more connected. Because with him, and he had a terrible neglect history, it was no small thing to be more connected. So we're connecting dots. We're paying attention. We're tracking. We're seeing if one thing correlates to another, or we're bringing things to awareness. Oh, that reminds me of when you said such and such, or I wonder if that might be why you feel such and such a way. And so we begin to help them by remembering important things they've told us. We begin to help them find more pieces that fit together in their own world. This is all about how we listen. So you listen with your whole self, with your whole heart. It's more than our usual focus, attunement. It requires a level of empathy, empathic attunement, essential. Such a missing experience. And finally, there's this complicated concept of projective identification. Now, this is a psychoanalytic concept, and those of us who, I actually feel very fortunate that I was schooled first and foremost in this sort of psychodynamic foundation, even though I kind of mostly outgrew a lot of it, but a lot of it is still there, is still with me in terms of my sort of my formation as a therapist. Projective identification is a very primitive process that happens between infant and parent, and it happens between clients and therapists. And it works like this. If there's a feeling or an experience or a feeling, an emotion or a thought or a concept, something very complicated that they can't quite digest, that they can't quite make sense out of themselves, they might put it inside of us to make sense out of and to feed back to them in a form that they can make use of. And it's complicated. And it's like sometimes if I might be so angry that I can't even begin to wrap my head around it because it's too unbearable, or it would undo me to look at it straight on, then in this very primitive way, I put it inside the therapist, and the therapist feels it. And this is where we have to be so keenly aware of our own material, so I can recognize when it's something that's not mine. So I feel this intense anger inside of me, and it's not mine. So what are they telling me they need help with? And then I might ask some questions. And if they're not able to tell me what they're feeling right now, I might be able to ask them, did anything happen last night? Or something that might lead to more of an explanation for this anger that is clearly too hot to handle, too big. And then between us, we begin to make sense out of a feeling and explain it and make it bearable and make it digestible and make it something that finds language. Kind of like when the mother bird chews up the food and then feeds it to the baby bird. And it's very, very subtle, which is why we have to be so self-aware with these processes. But children do it with their mothers, with their parents, and clients do it with us. And these neglect clients who in many ways are not able to speak, who never learned emotion, or who never had anyone to talk to, they need this kind of help and often relate in these very primitive ways. And so this is a language that we need to learn to be open to. So projective identification, it's complicated. It's worth reading more about. So as we listen, we want to be curious but not intrusive. And some of our clients are really sensitive about intrusiveness. One concept I haven't talked with you about, which I'll just name briefly in this webinar because we can't do everything in this webinar, but is the concept of the one-person psychology, which is a very interesting, it's another of the contradictions of neglect. And in the one-person psychology, on one hand, the child is very other-directed because they, as I said before, since they have no impact, they're very focused on the needs of the other, on what they can do for the other. They don't need the other person, so they're thinking about how they can either cut their losses or what they can do, to help the other or to at least, stay under the radar. And often their caregivers are so, in one way or another, disabled or damaged that they're looking for ways that they can help. So they're very much looking outward, and they lack their own identity, their own existence. So there is no me. But on the other hand, they live in such isolation. There is no one else. There's the self-reliant, this adamant, ferocious, not needing any other people. So there is no one but me. So on one hand, there is no me, and on the other hand, there's nobody else either. I'm in this desert by myself in my own little world. And so they might be very secretive. They might experience your interest as intrusive, or they might both crave your interest and curiosity, but be kind of defensive about what they do and don't want to tell you. So it's a real delicate balance, and often they really, they make their partners very upset because they make their partners feel so forgotten because they're so oblivious in their own world. I often hear it where you'll have a couple and the one partner will say, we'll be out walking, and he's like 8 feet ahead of me and he doesn't even notice I'm not with him. This person doesn't know how to walk with another person. And it's true. They don't, because they're so self-contained that they might forget that there's anybody else there. So on one hand, they're an island of desolate isolation, and on the other hand, they're longing to be known. So it's a balancing act. So we want to be curious, not intrusive. Figure out or learn about or inquire about what works for them. Tracking, remembering what they tell us. And as I experienced with my beloved therapist, she held my whole life. And so there was a living record of where I had been, that I had in fact lived and existed, and I had a witness, and she held it all with me. These are powerful missing experiences. So in the next segment, we'll talk a little bit about how the concretes of how we run our practice, and how that also is very significant with these clients, particularly so.